Hi, my name is Mark Anthony Perez, and in this video, we will be analyzing the titular classic tale, 1001 Nights, also known as Arabian Nights for our more Western audiences. We will be using the master-slave dialectic as proposed by Hegel, as well as elements of critical theory and a few other authors to try and piece together an understanding of how the frame story of Arabian Nights and its meta-narrative that it proposes by the utilization of that frame story works to create a power structure which can be analyzed in the vein of modern day society and give us an insight as to the nature of power, privilege, and storytelling. I hope you will join me on this adventure as we dive into the daunting, incredible, entertaining, and very, very dark tale of 1001 Nights. Before we can dive into this studious analysis, we gotta answer a few questions, right? Those questions being, what on earth is the Arabian Nights? What's the Hegelian dialectic? And how do these things relate together? As well as just a cursory glance of what is, storytelling, kind of. By understanding those basics, we can dive in and figure out how these stories piece together. Okay, so what is the Arabian Nights? Well, to summarize it super quickly, it is a story in which this guy, right? This guy, his name is Sultan. I'm gonna try real hard to pronounce this. Shahryar. I'm uncultured. Anyways, Sultan Shahryar has this wife that he loves a lot. Finds out that for years, she's been cheating on him, right? Sleeping with some other guy. So he does the only rational thing, and he has her killed. Okay, so maybe not the most rational thing. However, he then goes crazy. He then goes off the deep end and says, well, you know what? My wife cheated on me, therefore all women are, horrible. Kind of an incel. And decides that in order to prove it, I'm going to get married to a woman every night and have her strangled by morning. This happens a lot, by the way. A lot of women are killed in this process until he gets to one who very much does not want to die. Her name is Scheherazade, who also happens to be the vizier's daughter. The vizier being the guy who's kind of responsible, who's in charge of the whole murdering the wives thing. So, a lot of motive. It's real spicy. Basically, she devises a way to capture the Sultan's interest and prevent herself from dying, and maybe even break this never-ending trend of murder. And she does it by telling him a story, finishing the story, and then starting halfway through before they go to bed, so that he'll be too curious, too enthralled to actually kill her, because then he'd never finish the story. That's the Arabian Nights. To put it structurally, it is a frame story. It is a story in which a premise is created to explain the events of many smaller stories which serve as context to what is usually a moral point that the frame story is making, which is then but concretely solidified within the conclusion of the frame story. It's like a burger, but of narrative. It's a narrative burger. Next up is the master-slave dialectic. The master-slave dialectic is pretty quick. Basically, it's the idea of there are these two individuals, one being the master, the other being the slave. The master defines himself by their ownership of the slave. The slave defines himself by their position and their want to break free. So the master can never kill the slave, but needs to keep him under bondage in order to have his own self-affirming identity. The slave, however, can just keep fighting. So the master can never actually kill the slave, because then he'd be deprived of an identity. And this whole identity crisis, basically, the master can never win from their position. The slave can only ever keep trying until they break free, thus negating the original position of master-slave into a more egalitarian position. And this keeps happening until eventually you create an egalitarian society. It's the basis of progressive politics. So by now, undoubtedly, you would have noticed that there are some pretty striking similarities between those two. From a narrative point of view, the Sultan is the master. Narratively speaking, his role is defined by the subjugation and murder of his wives. He is this. We also call this the antagonist. We also call this situation the antagonist, right? In modern storytelling, but his situation is defined by that power hierarchy right there. Whereas the daughter, Scheherazade, that's a hard one. We're gonna call her Zadeh from now on. Zadeh, her position is defined in the dialectic as a slave. She is defined by her attempts to survive this dialectic, and in return, free herself from this bondage, and this solidifies her as the protagonist. This tells us a lot about the nature of power and what the story is really trying to get at. And don't take this from me. Take this from Hegel's own thoughts. In his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, he goes into the master-slave dialectic as defined previously. So what does this situation tell us, though? Those are explanations of power. But what do they tell us about power? What do they tell us about storytelling, about society? Simple. Stories are our method of internalizing and coming to grips with our position in the dialectic. I propose that the material conditions in which a storyteller is in, or that they observe, is what produces the stories that we consume. And let's think about this. It's a story about patriarchy. It's a story about misogyny and oppression, in which, in order to survive this institutionalized damage, she has to rebel time and time again every single night until eventually the situation is flipped. Until the master no longer holds murderous sway. And this story reoccurs throughout history, because it's a story that is familiar to humanity. It's a story of oppression and hierarchy. It's the story of a lesser power seeking liberation and survival, fighting against an opposing force determined to maintain a status quo beset upon the people arbitrarily. That's your hero's journey. Rename them. It's not Scheherazade. It's the protagonist. It's not the Sultan. It's your antagonist. And the internal stories that are told within, each one of them is a reverse of the dialectic. From the physician Douban showing the dangers of envy and fear, which is what produced the situation of the Sultan in the first place, to the story of the magical lamp, which is about generosity. Which was about generosity and wisdom, which a severe lack of those is what also produced situation. It's a story about storytelling. It's a story about humanity. This gets to the heart of what our class has been talking about this whole time, which is, what is a story and why do we write them? Deconstructing, using that Hegelian dialectic, combined with our understanding of something I've just gone over right now, proposed by the Frankfurt School of Philosophy, known as critical theory, which explores the material conditions of society and how that produces progress and egress. It shows that all human stories, at their essence, are dialectics. Inversions of previous positions of authority moving towards a human good. That is the role of the protagonist in every story, whatever that human good may be. In this story, it's survival, and thinking about it societally, a movement away from patriarchy, a negation the previous position to affirm an egalitarian one. And that is the nature of the Arabian Nights through this lens. Thank you.